morning, everybody. I've been asked to talk about wood turning design. And if anyone needs to leave before 6 o'clock, I won't mind. I have 9 pages of notes and quite a few pieces to show you, talk about. I come to you today with modest credentials. Some of you know I'm a retired architect. I had a business with a partner down in Fairlawn for 25 years, doing mostly commercial work. And secondly, I married my treasured wife many years ago. She was a student at the Cleveland Institute of Art and became a rather proficient ceramist, good enough with her work to be shown in the Canton Museum of Art. We traveled for about 30 years around the country with her work showing at juried art shows. And so in that process, I was exposed to many, many artists, probably hundreds, maybe even thousands of artists over the years, primarily looking at three-dimensional work, glass, paper, obviously ceramics, and wood. So those two things influence my work. Sometimes I look at ceramics and try to copy that idea in wood. Sometimes it's difficult, but that's where I come from. Much of my work, as you can see, derives from that background. What I have to say today are personal observations. You may or may not agree with some of them, and that's fine. I'm going to talk from notes. There's a lot to cover. As I mentioned, I have 9 pages. If there's any questions or clarification or counterpoint as I talk, please bring that up. Raise your hand, we'll talk about it. Mostly I will talk about bowls, platters, and boxes, because that's what I've been mostly interested in over the years. And my design, from the exposure that I've had, carries over into my work. First of all, a little bit of history about the lathe. As far as I can determine, the first lathe was a vertical lathe depicted in Egypt in the year 300 BC. Over the years and decades, it was modified to a horizontal lathe first, and as we might know it, a spring pole lathe, a treadle lathe evolved from that, and eventually a belt-driven lathe, and then obviously motor-driven. Up until about 1950, most wood turning work was very ornate, typically for chair legs and desk legs, stair spindles, those kinds of things, sometimes cut in half to be applied to the face of a desk or something, like a Chippendale desk. Most of you might be aware of that. Then about 1950, along came people like David Ellsworth and Dale Nish, who started working with, I'll call it distressed wood, knots, cracks, spalting, burls, all kinds of defects, and tried to make that into wood turning art. Eventually, or not eventually, but initially, it was looked on as a craft rather than art by the sophisticated art world. But then eventually, using better materials, they began making art as we know it. And you can see work by Hans Weisflog, Jack Vessery, Cindy Droza, Ben Foe. Those kinds of people have their work in museums and private collections all over the world. Now I admit Design is a very elusive commodity. Unlike ceramics or glasswork, which are very malleable materials, we work with something that is distractive or taken away from the initial piece of material. It's very difficult to add materials. Some of my pieces you'll see additions, like this platter over here. But in most cases, it's a process of subtracting material to get to an object. Now, today's design presentation involves a number of considerations. Curves, bases, rims, proportions, details, texture, color, effects of lighting, surface reflection from the piece, artistic or utilitarian function, nature of the wood species, grain orientation. All are considerations when we go to make a piece. Things like weight and balance, grasp, ability to pick it up, weight distribution, all are supplemental to the aesthetic considerations. Now, I suspect that a lot of your work is utilitarian in nature. But I'd also bet that most of your work rests on a table or a desk or maybe a cabinet somewhere. And if it does, is that now art? And should it not be pleasant to look at or beautiful? Which begs the question, is the piece utilitarian or is it art? Now, a utilitarian piece maybe should be lighter in weight, thicker on the bottom to provide stability, wider at the base so it's not tippy. Maybe the rim should be easy to handle. There should be minimum decoration so that it's easy to clean. It should be maybe relatively small for storage. And it should have a tougher finish because it's going to be washed or cleaned somehow, handled a lot. So it needs a tougher finish. Now, an example of that might be a simple salad bowl. This is a little heavier on the bottom. It has a rim that's easy to hold and pass around if you had salad in it. It's a functional piece. Ordinary wood, typically, nothing real special, just a simple salad bowl. Now, if we're talking about a pure art form, maybe the base should be narrower. The surface areas are available for decoration or detail or color. It should have pleasant curves, which maybe a salad bowl may or may not have. It would have more texture, color, applied detail. Maybe a softer finish to show off the grain. More attention to the grain pattern. More attention to the profile and the curves that are existing. And certainly a higher quality of wood. Now, maybe some examples of that would be this piece, which has no function, okay, other than simply to look at. It's a decorative, artistic piece. You may or may not agree with the detail or the design, but it is an art piece rather than a utilitarian piece. This is a relatively simple box. It's a 3-piece. It has a ring entry, secondary ring piece, and then a bowl for a brooch or some other thing, rings, whatever. It's a simple design, and I would call that more an artistic piece than a utilitarian piece. So, talking about utility in art forms, you should think about the function of the piece before you even start. And it could be a tweener, what I call a tweener. This piece here is arguably an art piece. However, it has a bowl. The theme on this was to give the impression that this was spinning from the design that you see here. And on the lathe, it was spinning, and this is a continuation of the idea that it was spinning. But you could use this in the center of a table somewhere and put M&Ms in it or something like that to make it a utilitarian piece rather than art. Well, like all these pieces, they have bottoms. There's a bottom. Okay? Not very wide. It's tippy. That's okay. We'll talk about that later. Now, this is a rather long sentence, but pay attention. The process of this process of making something is arriving at good proportions, creating good curves, deciding an appropriate base, detailing a compatible rim. The addition of coves, beads, textures, etc. is a difficult process and is always, I repeat, always subject to improvement, if ever so subtle, especially when viewed in profile. If you look at a piece in profile, this is maybe not the best example. Here's a better example. Looking at it in profile is important, especially on a higher piece. We'll talk about that a little more later. The quality of the profile is of paramount importance. The relationship of the curves, the intersection of the rim to the body of the bowl or the platter. There are many examples here we'll talk about. The body as it relates to the base. And obviously the exterior dictates the interior. There are several major considerations. Proportion, the overall shape of the bowl or box or platter or any wood turning, particularly vessels, vases, or peppermills, where only the exterior surface is observable, is very critical, so that the profile of this piece and the curves that are entertained is very, very critical. It should have a visual balance. It could be symmetrical or asymmetrical, such as this piece, which I would hint that this is an asymmetrical piece. Originally round, but bandsawed into a shape that's no longer round, making it an asymmetrical piece. And we can talk about asymmetrical curves later, but from a profile standpoint and a view from above, this is obviously a asymmetrical turning. Maybe the piece should have rhythm. Rhythm meaning a repetition of components or details, something that draws the eye to that kind of rhythm. This is not a particularly good example, but this is what I might call rhythm with purposely turned circles to replicate the round shape. Nothing special, but it has a certain amount of rhythm. It's often nice to have emphasis on a particular piece. In this case, I'm talking about something like this piece, which at first viewing, your eye is drawn to this little strip of wood. This piece is red mallee from Australia. It's basically a burl. It came to me with a chainsaw top with a very deep divot here from the chainsaw. I had a choice of either reducing the size or doing something else. So I decided, why not leave that groove from the chainsaw in the piece and add some wood to make an emphasis or a focal point for that particular piece. Very simple on the back, but a focal point. This little guy, made a long time ago, believe it or not, is on 2 axes. This is very thin. This is about 1/4 of an inch thick to visually support this little ball. No big deal, but it has a focal point. When you look at this initially, the first thing you look at is the ball on its little base, a focal point. I have here another small bowl. When you first look at that, your eye is immediately drawn to the very narrow red stripe. Then it may wander elsewhere, but it has a focal point, even though it's a little tiny, reasonably detailed small bowl. A focal point. Here's another example. When you first look at this, you're immediately drawn to the black ring. You may then look at some of the beautiful grain that it has, but it does have a focal point in this band that was deliberately put in for that purpose. We can talk about weight distribution a little bit. As I mentioned, the utilitarian piece should be a little heavier on the bottom, simply to give it stability. But an artistic piece can be quite delicate in its balance. The weight can shift visually, whatever. But weight does count as an ingredient. Now lastly, we have tactile feel. Typically, an applied texture, not just poor sanding that gives you some texture, but something like this. When you pick this up, it has a tactile feel on the top, on the rim. And I do this quite frequently. I like doing it. There are many, many ways of doing it, which I'll talk about later. But rather simple, but it gives you a certain tactile feel, which is quite nice sometimes. Now, most important, a bad shape remains a bad shape, irrespective of additional beads, coves, texture, or whatever. Because the shape is all that's left in a number of years when the grain and the finish and the color all fade with time. All that's left is the shape. The shape will also dictate at times the addition of coves or beads or texture. You may or may not choose to do those after you're in the process of creating this piece. Now, my first turnings, when I first began, were wonderful, as were yours. You know, look what I did on a wood lathe. It's fantastic, beautiful. They're all now clunkers. Now, I still make clunkers. Here's an example. This is not even finished yet. This particular piece, in its current condition, is too high, should be lower. I decided to, after I had this texture applied to the entire surface, I decided to make rims around the bowl and the perimeter. I shouldn't have. I'm not particularly keen about this particular curve, although I thought in the beginning it might be nice. I call that a clunker. My problem is that I like exploring ideas, sometimes poorly executed. I like testing my skills. I like trying new tools. So in that process, oftentimes I get a piece I'm not totally happy with or it turns out wrong, as we all do. Now I have a little sidebar to talk about. Stuart and Alan Batty are world famous woodturners from England. And Alan is gone now, but a few years ago he was working on a 12-inch diameter, 10-foot long porch column. And they had a young fellow, college-age kid, working in the shop. He swept floors and sorted wood and that sort of thing. And Alan was working on this porch column, and as only the British can say, it got loose from its moorings. Went past his ear, hit the ceiling, bounced off a couple machines, rolled across the floor. The kid, in a flash, he's out the door, down the steps to the courtyard below. And so Alan walks over to the window. Hey, get back up here. We pay you to catch those things. The method of chucking can dictate the foot size, obviously. And so the jaws that you have may or may not dictate the base that you put on a particular piece, which could be wrong. So we either need more jaw sets or put a waste block on it so that you can get the appropriate size base. And there's no need for a big 3/8 inch deep tenon. You can get by with 3/16 to 1/4 of an inch if you wish. I've used jaws that grab a base of maybe at the most 1/4 of an inch, even on very large pieces like this platter over here. So think about the base size relative to the jaw sets that you have, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. The foot becomes very important, and I've drawn up here rather crudely some ideas for bases, if I'm still on the camera. A utilitarian bowl might have quite a wide base. An artistic piece might have quite a narrow base. And then we talk about the shape flowing into the base, where these two are saying, I am a base, and I'm supporting this piece. In this instance, the same is true, except it all flows together. You can elevate it, such as on this bowl here. And there's more to talk about this piece a little later, but you can elevate that. If you really get crazy, you can elevate a real high base. Now the purpose behind this one is this is a relatively thin platter, and I wanted to bring it up off the table. So I have this ring here, which simply visually replicates the base, okay, and lifts this whole piece up off the table. The base would normally be 1/4 to 1/3 of the diameter, except on a functional piece it could be up to 1/2 of the diameter. And trays, which I don't have an example, I make trays for serving, that would have a base of about 80% of the diameter. Very, very stable and very thin so that you can use that to distribute beer or whatever. The function of the base is to float the piece above the surface of the desk or the table to show that it has some presence, not just flat on the table. The ceramists that I know, when they make just a flat piece on the table, they call that a dog food bowl. It doesn't have any base to support it visually. The other thing the base does is it gives you a place for your signature. You should identify your piece. I'll talk about that more later too. Now, as far as curves go, you should all have either a chain or a very light string so that you can hold it up to form a catenary curve, which this represents. You'll see that in bridges all over the world. Now that catenary curve is not a circle, but can be used like for a bowl or a platter or a vase. Almost any turning that you make can be derivative from a catenary curve or multiples of a catenary curve and not a circle. So if you want to pick up a piece of chain somewhere and hold that up once in a while to give you ideas on what that curve should be. Straight lines are foreign to a round object and boring, in my opinion. An asymmetric curve is almost always better than a pure curve, no matter the subject matter. Now, the widest diameter of a piece should be about 60 to 70% above the bottom of the piece. It doesn't matter what the shape is. You can have a bowl, you can have a vessel, you can have a vase, doesn't matter. All of these should be right at about 60%. And I borrowed a piece from the table. This is a perfect piece, very, very well done. And you will notice the widest part of the bowl, of the vessel, is right at about 60% or so. Beautiful curves, very well done. But that lifts the piece from whatever it's setting on, rather than the reverse, which makes the piece look like it's slumping on the table instead of being elevated. Particularly OG curves. If you have an OG curve that comes down like this, you always want to repeat this curve even slightly in the base so that it reflects what's happening above it. You never want to bring that curve down and just flatten it off. If you're trying to combine any kind of OG or a curve, external curve with a reverse curve, that becomes very delicate to handle and difficult. Now, another component of your design is the grain. If we take a log that has all these rings, and you make a bowl here out of that, the rings will look like this. If you make a bowl from here, the rings will look like this. Totally different. The objective is to try and center, in any event, center that grain so that it reflects your ability to use the grain as a ingredient to the turning. And some of these you'll see that are not that way, and others you will. This one is more or less centered. This one is more or less centered. It's part of the design. Think about it. That's another one. Okay? The visual impression of the piece or the object should be reflected in the handling weight. If it looks light, it should be light. If it's heavy, it should be heavy. I've got lots of heavy pieces here. This is a heavy piece. Some of these others are also, particularly this one. This is quite heavy, but it's also babinga, which is a very heavy wood.
How much time do you have with that?
In this piece, about 40 hours. Yeah. I can talk about this. I'll talk about it now. This piece is babinga with oak strips. Obviously done initially on a radial arm saw. I turned this diameter so it was exact multiples of 3/8 of an inch, so that as I came around, they would all be identical. Then I saw cut these on a skid so that when the saw came through, it created a slope on the rim. So I have a skid under this. I had a marking on my saw with a stop so that I could rotate this around at 3/8 of an inch each time. After that was done, this is still solid in the center. I painted the red strips. Then I turned the rest of this out to finish the shape. Then I made a bunch of these strips and laid them in. In this particular case, I used a drawing, which I don't normally do, to arrange the pattern, which is not consistent. It changes as it goes around. Then I cut these strips, hopefully on the angle that I needed to make it flow. Some of them were not correctly cut, so I had to have spares to change the angle or the length on each one of these. And then they're all numbered, by the way, and then they were glued back in. Okay? This particular piece was thought out prior to starting. Okay? Most of my work is done as I go, as I flow through the piece. The reason being, you oftentimes, as you all know, you uncover things in the wood that you may want to take advantage of or get rid of, okay? A knot maybe. Oftentimes you'll have a perfectly good piece of wood, you start turning it and there's a knot inside, or maybe a crack, okay? So you have to be nimble and shift around a little bit. But most of the time I'm just sort of turning as I go and create something. There are other pieces here, obviously this one, okay? This piece was predetermined. And while I'm here, I had 4 centers on a waste block that I used a screw chuck on. This was finished, waste block, 4 centers, and then sequentially turned down and then carved later. So that was all predetermined as far as where the locations of the centers should be. Okay? So that's another example of thinking ahead. I probably took a compass on the surface and located some circles and then replicated that center on the backside. I don't remember, it's a couple years ago. But that's the general approach. Rims. Rims are extremely important. No matter if it's a bowl or a platter, doesn't matter. The rim defines the relationship of the external interior surfaces, often a bead or a cove or some other detail at the juncture of the rim to the bowl. Now, rims can be sloped in, they can be level, they can be sagging on the outside, always concave, rarely flat. Once again, flat, straight, foreign to a turned object. Now, when we're talking about details at the rim, I have several examples. First of all, a very simple rim to bowl shape would have a detailed outside and inside recess to focus the treatment of the texture as a separate entity. Contrasted with that, you have this bowl, which does not have that. The entire surface is textured from the outside all the way to the inside. In this case, there was no texture except the center ring, which was wood burned and then coated with acrylic. But in every case, there's a relationship between the rim and the beginnings of the bowl. And to show you what really should happen is you have a rim that's coming down, and then you may put a cove here or something before you get to the inside of the bowl. Now, I would advise you that if you're going to put a cove there, do not bring it down, put a cove, and then the bowl. Because now the cove looks like it's falling in the bowl. There needs to be something between the cove and the beginnings of the bowl itself, or the platter, so that it defines the rim from the bowl. When you're texturing something, it can be color or any kind of carving, Dremel approach, whatever. It should be contained somehow, such as this, as a general statement, rather than this one, which is an older bowl. This is 2000. That's before I knew anything. Anyway, consider that on the rim to contain it somehow with some sort of detail. This is kind of an interesting little story. This is a little curly maple bowl, wood burned from rim to base. This was done before it was hollowed out, because when you wood burn, it always burns adjacent to where you want it. Same thing with the base. This was all wood burned, then this was finished, and the bowl was made. So I made this. This is wood burned, then acrylic paint applied with a toothbrush, not a paintbrush. The paintbrush will leave too much paint in the low wood burned areas. So you scrub it with a toothbrush with acrylic paint. No finish. I started to make another one. Went up for lunch. Came back. I said, that's kind of cool. I'll leave that alone. So this is half of that. No finish. But the tan overburn plus the wood burned areas itself, I thought made a pretty nifty pattern. So I left it alone. So kind of think about those things as you are making something. Sometimes accidents happen. Now we've been talking about textures. As you probably know, you can use a Dremel, such as this piece, a Fordham. Some of you have Fordham tools. All kinds of carving tools, hand carving tools. An Automak, which is a tool made in Japan, which is basically a vertically vibrating tool with interchangeable tips, such as this one. This was done with an Automak. It's basically a round gouge. Years ago, I would try to do that by hand. And after I finished about that much, I couldn't move my fingers. So I bought an Automak, which does that for me. Very flexible. You can make all kinds of curves, whatever you like. It's a wonderful tool. All kinds of burning. Now this one, simple little bowl, platter, whatever, has all three. This has wood burn texture, then applied acrylic paint, and then little gold, it's called gold finger. It comes in a little tube, comes in gold, bronze, copper, and aluminum. You put a little dab on your finger and just rub it on. So there's all kinds of products available to you. If you look around, play with them a little bit, look at them in combination, and do your thing. You also have all the celery texturing tools and burrs. But great thought should be put into applied finishes. There's a tendency to overdo it. There are a variety of paints, dyes, pastes, and other texturing materials. I mentioned gold finger and gold leaf. You can also use grooves, beads, coves, color, texture, stain, carving. All can be applied without distracting from the profile if they're applied judiciously. There's a tendency to demonstrate coves and beads on your pieces just to show workmanship. But unless they're applied judiciously and carefully, you detract from the piece. Just showing off workmanship is not necessarily advisable. Beads will always look better if they're applied to a curve, like so, whatever, rather than indented. So that the tips of the curves can form the part, continue the curve that you're trying to achieve. They should stand out. They should be a cove. In reverse, the grooves are obviously indented. Now, Mark Lindquist, who was a marvelous turner back in the 50s, made a statement. A turning approaches being perfect when nothing can be changed, added, or subtracted. Now think about that. You've got a piece, it will approach perfect if it can't be changed in any way. Difficult to achieve. I have never created a perfect piece and never will. There's always some slight adjustment or the slightest change in curve, whatever, to make it better. Consider your applied finishes carefully. We have dull, semi-gloss, and gloss. Gloss looks terrific on a pepper mill or any small vase that's round and does not reflect a lot of light. However, on a platter, you don't want a real shiny finish on a platter because it detracts from the grain. Once you get light shining on a glossy surface, the grain disappears. So think about the finish you're going to put on a particular piece for that reason. Now, I've probably skipped over a couple of things. I'm going to go back to this piece. When I talked about clunkers, this was done 2001. I thought it was terrific. It's not. I'll give you some reasons. Am I on camera properly? This should have been more pronounced curve coming in. This is way too fat at the bottom. There's no need whatsoever for this little detail that I put on this thing. It should have flowed into the base with another curve, like I talked about, into the base, so that the base curve reflected this curve. Okay? It's too heavy. It's too thick. It's 3-piece, by the way. These wall thicknesses are too thick. I did have the foresight of using this black ebony as a knob, another knob, and then a piece at the bottom. So that was good. But the curvature of the tray is too heavy. The top could have been maybe a little shallower. But all in all, not a good piece, my opinion. And by now, yours. On the other hand, I have 2 granddaughters that have about 1 million dangle earrings, always in a box, always tangled up. So I thought, there's got to be a better way. So I made a bunch of these, not a bunch, several, to hang their dangle earrings around the perimeter. They don't get tangled anymore. They're easily identified. Just lift them off the hole, so forth. Inside, there's space for some sort of brooch or whatever. I don't know that much about women's jewelry, but something inside. Now, this particular piece I'm fond of because the base elevates the box for obvious reasons, so these dangle down. But other than that, the base is consistent with the shape of the box, the bowl, And this detail here says I am a base and I am supporting this bulbous bowl. The curvature of the top flows right through the side, even though this rim is in the way. The curvature of the top flows down to here, which it should. Okay? The finial is about the right size and easily handled to enter the inside. I was fairly happy with this kind of design as a functional utilitarian piece to hold a bunch of earrings. This is a burl on the side of the tree. This is bark on here. When you get the piece, it's all bark. So that's turned away and left alone, which brings up an interesting story. I bought several of these from a fellow in Utah. They come with bark. The whole thing's covered with bark. So I'm in there with a toothpick and all kinds of screwdrivers and everything else trying to pry the bark off. Impossible. So I call him up and I say, how do you get the bark off these things? Well, he said, you take them down to the car wash and you blast the bark off, which I did. I had several. The next time I went to the car wash, there's a big sign. Landscapers, not allowed. Because I made a mess. I would say 90% of the time, almost all of these are general finishes, gel, they call it gel coat. It looks exactly like Vaseline. Color, texture, everything, it's Vaseline. But you put it on a small pad. I take a 6x6 t-shirt, fold it twice into a 3x3 pad, take a spoon or something, put a little, say a half of a spoonful on the rag, and you simply start wiping it on. 4 coats. I would advise you, if you use it, work quickly initially, because the density on the rag is quite high, and if you're finishing walnut, let's say, that soaks in immediately and will leave you a streak of darker wood because there's more material to soak in. So you take that pad and you quickly rub it all over to get it mostly covered, and then work it into the entire surface. It will start to get tacky after about maybe 3 minutes. So you simply, I have a lazy Susan kind of thing with a plywood top. So you set it on there and you can run this around and rub it and keep it going so that the entire surface is covered. Probably not a good explanation. Any questions?
Did you think of the name of the general finish yet?
General Finish Gel Coat.
Gel coat.
Yep. Comes in a blue can.
Just gel coat.
I believe so. Yeah. I think it's probably a urethane of types.
I use it and it works very well.
Yeah, it works really well, really well. You get it at Hartville Hardware. How do you determine the finial size? How large in diameter, how high, etc. But I cheat. I have a little plastic tray, and I made about maybe 15 or so, all different sizes, all different materials, walnut, well, just all kinds of species. Different sizes, different widths, different heights, different designs, etc. Now, when I have a piece, I've got this made. I say, well, I go to my box and I say, well, you know, this one looks right. No, it's too high. I like this one, but it's too fat. This one looks about right. So that's the one I use. So I cheat. But it's a good technique because you will not get it right the first time. seldom. So I just have a bunch of them that I try, they all have the same base, a little short 1/8 inch or so base. And you'll notice that the inside is a little thicker so that the drill doesn't make a funnel out of this thing. Anyway, that's how I do it. Good. The question is, how do I sand? I would usually start with about maybe 150, depending on the piece, depending on the species. I work 150, 180, 220, 320, 400, 600. As I've mentioned before in demonstrations, if you have a reversible lathe, that's good. Because when the piece comes around, you obviously have end grain and normal grain. The fibers are bent over. Whoops, and this way, they're bent over. So you can sand and sand and sand, but the fibers are always bent over. If you have a reversible lathe, if you alternate between grits, now you're bending them over and then bending them back. Bending them over, bending them back, right? That helps, especially on end grain. It's tough to work with. As I mentioned before, I've probably done several hundred turnings. Rarely or never a perfect one. There's always a chance to improve it, however subtle. And sometimes you don't notice that until it's off the lathe and maybe even finished. However, I routinely revisit my work and criticize and evaluate it. I can always find improvement. It might be the base size, combination of curves, the rim width on any of these, terminations, details, applied finish, whatever. There's always a possibility of improvement. And I challenge you to review your past work critically, because you will improve your future work. I'd also suggest that you sign your work, because when you're gone and 25 years pass and your work is in a museum, they're not going to know who JB is. So sign your work, and maybe even identify the species of the wood. It's walnuts, maple, whatever. And maybe you want to date it. But certainly sign it. I see things on the table with initials. I don't know who that is. And no one else will either. Look at the show and tell table and evaluate the work critically with your mouth closed. Why is one piece better than another? How would you improve it? Or why would you improve it? What was the maker trying to achieve? Think about how they feel. Pick them up. And definitely compliment the maker when it's an excellent piece of a product. I thank you for your attention.